Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the life you thought you had, the secure, predictable, well-ordered life, was nothing more than an illusion. That's what happened to me. I was the guy who believed he had everything under control. A successful career in healthcare, a stable marriage with a woman I loved, and plans for a future that felt so tangible I could almost touch it. But in one seemingly ordinary moment, everything came crashing down. It started innocuously enough. A small, almost trivial change in my health that I noticed during a routine morning. I'd been brushing my teeth when I caught sight of something off. A minor irritation that I couldn't immediately explain. It wasn't painful, just unusual. I remember squinting into the mirror, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I was always diligent about my health, after all. Years of working as a medical professional taught me the value of prevention, the importance of catching things early. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that something wasn't right. Later that day, in between appointments at the clinic, I used the quiet moments to research potential causes. My rational mind insisted it was nothing, perhaps a minor imbalance, maybe stress. I'd been working long hours, after all. But as I dug deeper into the possibilities, the unease began to grow. By the time I scheduled an appointment for myself, I couldn't deny it anymore. I was worried. When the test results came back, my worst fears were confirmed. The diagnosis was unambiguous, a clinical certainty that left no room for doubt. It was an infection, one that couldn't have been contracted by chance. It was the kind of thing that was only transmitted through one very specific way. Statistically, I knew it was rare for someone in my position to misdiagnose something so straightforward. Still, I double-checked everything. I reviewed the lab reports, considered alternate explanations, tried to find some other angle that would absolve me of the growing suspicion gnawing at my insides. But there was no mistake. The results were accurate. And that's when my entire world shifted. The implications were impossible to ignore. I'd been faithful to my wife, completely, unwaveringly faithful. There was no gray area, no room for error. That meant the infection hadn't come from me. The only other possibility was that it had come from her. For a long moment, I just sat there in stunned silence. I remember the cool surface of my office desk under my fingers, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. My mind raced through every memory, every conversation, every mundane detail of our life together, trying to make sense of it. Emily and I had always had a relationship built on trust, or so I believed. We weren't the kind of couple that kept secrets from each other. At least that's what I thought. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the results were somehow wrong. Could they have been mixed up with someone else's? I checked and rechecked the lab codes, the names, the dates. Everything matched. Or maybe I thought there was some other explanation. Something I didn't yet understand. A fluke, a mistake. Surely there had to be a reason that didn't involve betrayal. My mind latched onto that hope like a drowning man grasping for a life raft. But the hope didn't last. Slowly, inexorably, I was forced to confront the truth. There was no mistake. There was no misunderstanding. Someone had violated the trust that formed the foundation of our marriage. And that someone wasn't me. The realization hit me like a wave during a storm, cold and unrelenting. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. I leaned back in my chair, staring blankly at the computer screen, the diagnosis glaring back at me in black and white. It wasn't just about the infection anymore, it was about everything. The life I thought I had, the stability I had worked so hard to maintain, the future I had planned. All of it felt suddenly fragile, like a glass house waiting for the next stone to shatter it completely. As the hours ticked by, I couldn't help but replay moments from the past few months. Moments that I dismissed as unimportant at the time. Hadn't she been working late more often than usual? And what about the sudden, almost imperceptible changes in her behavior? The subtle distance that I'd written off as stress, the newfound attention to her appearance, the phone she kept closer to her now than ever before. Looking back, I realized there had been signs, small, almost invisible cracks in the foundation of our marriage that I'd chosen not to see. Not because I was blind, but because I trusted her. Because I wanted to believe that we were different, that we were solid. Now, that trust felt like a cruel joke. I sat there, numb, grappling with the enormity of it all. How could this have happened? How could I not have seen it? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do next? For the first time in my life, I didn't have the answers. At first, I refused to believe it. This couldn't be my life. We were happy, or so I thought. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the more those tiny details, the ones I'd dismissed so easily before, began to surface in my mind. Like whispers in the dark, they refused to be ignored. The late nights at work were the first thing I recalled. They started gradually, just an extra hour here and there. Deadlines, she'd said. A big project. It wasn't unusual. Her job had always been demanding. I didn't question it at the time because it was normal for us to support each other. When I had to pull extra shifts or cover for a colleague, she never complained. Why should I have doubted her when she needed to do the same? But then there were the changes to her appearance. Emily had always been beautiful, but she was never one to fuss over her looks excessively. Lately, though, she seemed different. A new skincare routine, a more meticulous approach to her makeup, clothes that flattered her figure in a way she never cared much about before. At first, I thought she was doing it for herself. After all, she deserved to feel confident and good about how she looked. But as I replayed those moments in my head, I couldn't help but wonder if there was another reason. And then there was the look in her eyes. That's the detail that haunted me the most. It wasn't something you could point to directly, but it was there, nonetheless. A subtle distance, like she was always somewhere else, lost in thoughts she wouldn't share. I'd asked her about it once, teasingly, "Where did you drift off to just now?" She'd laughed, brushing it off, saying she was just tired. I believed her then. I had no reason not to. But now, with everything I'd discovered, the pieces started to fit together in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. Still, I wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. What if I was wrong? What if I was misreading everything, letting paranoia get the best of me? I didn't want to be the kind of person who tore apart their own marriage based on suspicion alone. I needed answers, real answers. So I decided to wait and observe. I paid closer attention to her routine, her behavior, the things she said, and more importantly, the things she didn't say. I started piecing together the little inconsistencies that I'd ignored before. I became a collector of moments, gathering every fragment of truth I could find, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. I noticed, for example, that there were certain places she mentioned casually. Places she said she'd been after work or during a break. That didn't quite add up. A coffee shop she hadn't mentioned before. A boutique I didn't think she'd ever visited. I couldn't prove anything yet, but the pattern was there, like a map of her day that didn't quite match the one I thought I knew. Then there were the people. Names I'd heard in passing, dropped into conversation without much context. "Oh, I had lunch with Kelly today," she'd say. Or, "Tom from marketing needed help with his presentation." First, I didn't think twice about it. But as time went on, I started to notice how often these same names came up, and how little I knew about the people behind them. I kept my suspicions to myself, not wanting to tip her off. I didn't ask probing questions or accuse her of anything outright. Instead, I listened carefully, letting her words fill in the gaps in the story she didn't realize she was telling. And then, one evening, I stumbled upon something that confirmed what I'd been dreading. Emily's phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, buzzing softly as she took a call in the other room. I glanced at the screen without thinking, and there it was. A notification for a message from someone I didn't know. The name was unfamiliar, but the content, just the preview visible on the lock screen, made my stomach drop. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Last night was amazing." Felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, willing it to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a friend, I thought. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But deep down, I knew. I put the phone back where I found it before she could notice, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't confront her right then. I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed more proof, something undeniable. So I kept watching, listening, gathering evidence. I followed the threads of her life, unraveling the parts she'd hidden from me piece by piece. And as the days went on, the full picture began to emerge. The places she went without telling me. The people she spent time with who I'd never met. The parts of her life that had nothing to do with me, even though they should have. It was all there, laid out before me, impossible to ignore. By the time I had everything I needed, I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I was certain. My wife, the woman I had trusted with my whole heart, was keeping secrets. And those secrets were about to destroy everything. The moment I decided to follow her, everything in my world felt like it was moving in slow motion. Each step I took, each decision I made, was like walking on the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground beneath me could give way at any moment. But I had to know. I had to see it for myself. It started with the little breadcrumbs I had already gathered. The unexplained absences, the names of people I didn't recognize, the places she frequented that she never mentioned to me. By the time I started keeping track of her movements, I already knew in my heart that something was wrong. But I told myself I wasn't ready to confront her until I had undeniable proof. I wasn't going to accuse my wife of something so devastating without being absolutely certain. So I waited, patiently. I began leaving work early on certain days without telling her, parking my car a block away from our house, and observing. I noticed the small, seemingly insignificant details. The way she'd linger at the front door before locking it, looking down at her phone as if waiting for a signal. The way she suddenly had an extra bounce in her step when she thought no one was watching. It was late one Friday afternoon when the moment I'd been dreading finally arrived. I had finished my work earlier than expected and decided to go home without letting her know. I wasn't intentionally trying to catch her. I told myself that I just wanted to surprise her, to spend an unexpected evening together. But deep down, I think I knew. I think I was preparing myself for what I might find. The house was eerily quiet when I arrived. I parked a few houses down to avoid making noise and walked up the driveway. I noticed right away that something felt off. Emily's car was in the driveway, but the curtains in the living room were drawn shut. She never closed them during the day. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sound of my footsteps on the pavement ringing in my ears. I reached the front door and turned the handle as quietly as I could, stepping inside. The air inside the house was heavy, almost suffocating. There was a faint, unfamiliar scent lingering in the hallway, a mix of cologne and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I stood there for a moment, frozen, listening, and then I heard it. Faint laughter coming from upstairs. A man's laugh. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself there had to be some other explanation. Maybe she had a friend over, someone I hadn't met. Maybe it was innocent. But as I climbed the stairs, every step felt like it was dragging me closer to the edge of a precipice. The laughter grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from our bedroom. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see the edge of the bed and part of the room. My hands were trembling as I pushed it open. And there they were. Emily was in our bed with our neighbor, Paul. She was completely naked, the sheets barely covering her as she scrambled to sit up. Paul, equally naked, looked up at me with wide eyes, his face turning pale. The air was suddenly filled with a deafening silence, broken only by the sound of my shallow breathing and the rustle of fabric as Emily grabbed at the sheets to cover herself. Paul didn't say a word. He grabbed his clothes from the floor and bolted out of the room like a man on fire, avoiding my gaze entirely. I didn't stop him. I didn't care about him. My eyes were fixed on Emily, who was now sitting on the edge of the bed, clutching the sheet around her as if it could shield her from the weight of my stare. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The reality of what I'd just seen was crashing down around me, each second making it harder to breathe. My mouth felt dry, and my chest was tight, but I managed to force out a single word. Why? Emily flinched at the sound of my voice, her lips trembling as she searched for something to say. I didn't mean for you to find out this way, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, waiting. I wanted to hear her explain herself. I wanted to know what possible justification she thought she could offer for what she'd done. She continued, her voice shaking. It's not what you think. It's complicated. Complicated. I repeated, my tone flat, devoid of emotion. I felt like I was watching the scene unfold from outside my body, like it was happening to someone else. You were in our bed, Emily. With him. What exactly about that is complicated? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel any sympathy. I never wanted to hurt you, she said, her voice breaking. It just happened. I don't know how to explain it. You don't know how to explain it? I echoed, shaking my head in disbelief. You've had months to figure that out, Emily. Months. Was he worth it? Was this worth it? She didn't answer. She just sat there, tears streaming down her face, her silence louder than any words she could have spoken. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't even cry. I just stood there, feeling the cold emptiness settle in my chest, spreading through me like ice. Whatever life I thought we had together, whatever love I thought we shared, it was gone. It had been gone for a long time. I just hadn't realized it until now. Finally, I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't look back. The days following that moment in our bedroom felt like walking through a haze. Everything was muted, my thoughts moving slowly, my emotions dulled by shock. I hadn't yelled or argued with Emily that day, but inside, I was a storm. My trust was shattered, my love for her reduced to ashes, and the life we had built together suddenly felt like a cruel joke. I slept in the guest room that night, or rather, I lay awake on the small, uncomfortable bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in my mind like a broken record, each replay more painful than the last. When the first rays of morning sunlight crept through the blinds, I made my decision. I was filing for divorce. When Emily came downstairs the next morning, her eyes were swollen from crying. She looked at me like she didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. "We need to talk," she began, her voice tentative. "We've done enough talking," I replied coldly. "There's nothing left to say, Emily. I'm contacting a lawyer today." Her face crumpled, and she began to sob. "Please," she begged, reaching for my arm. "Don't do this. I made a mistake, a horrible mistake. I wasn't thinking. It didn't mean anything, I swear." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, pulling away from her touch. "You destroyed our marriage for something that didn't mean anything? You betrayed me, Emily, in our home, in our bed, and you expect me to believe it was meaningless." She fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please, don't throw away everything we've built. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through it. I'll do anything. Just please, don't give up on us." Her desperation was palpable, but it only fueled my anger. "You gave up on us the moment you decided to cheat," I said, my voice steady despite the fury boiling inside me. "You don't get to plead for forgiveness now. This isn't something you can undo with a few tears and promises." For weeks, Emily tried everything to change my mind. She left me handwritten notes, full of apologies and declarations of love. She bombarded me with messages, sending paragraphs about how sorry she was and how she'd do anything to make things right. Once, she even showed up at my workplace, standing outside in the rain, begging me to talk to her. I ignored it all. The divorce process was grueling, not because of the legalities, but because of the emotional weight of it. Sitting across from Emily in the lawyer's office, I barely recognized the woman I had once loved. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her once bright eyes dull with regret. She cried through every meeting, begging me to reconsider, to stop the proceedings. But I couldn't. "I can't trust you anymore, Emily," I told her during one particularly heated session. "Without trust, there's nothing. You made your choice. Now, I'm making mine." When the divorce was finalized, Emily's life began to unravel. The once confident, vibrant woman who had walked into our marriage was now a shell of herself. Paul, the neighbor she had risked everything for, disappeared almost immediately after the truth came out. He wanted nothing to do with her, and the scandal of our divorce made him a pariah in the neighborhood. He moved away within a month, leaving Emily completely alone. She tried to pick up the pieces of her life, but it wasn't easy. Her reputation was in tatters. Friends who had once admired her loyalty and kindness turned their backs on her. Even her family, who had always supported her, were disappointed and distant. "You had everything, Emily," her mother had reportedly said. "Why did you throw it all away?" She lost her job a few months after the divorce. Whether it was because of the stress affecting her performance or because her coworkers had caught wind of the affair, I never found out. I only knew that she was struggling financially, moving into a small, run-down apartment on the edge of town. She called me once, late at night, her voice slurred with alcohol. "I don't know how to fix this," she said through sobs. "I don't know how to go on without you. Please, tell me what to do." "You don't fix this," I told her bluntly. "You live with the consequences, just like I've had to." After that, I blocked her number. I couldn't keep letting her drag me back into the mess she had created. I needed to move on, to rebuild my life without the weight of her betrayal hanging over me. As the years passed, I heard bits and pieces about Emily through mutual acquaintances. She bounced between low-paying jobs, struggling to make ends meet. Her relationships never lasted, and the few friends she had left eventually drifted away. Once I saw her at the grocery store. She looked older, worn down by the life she had created for herself. She tried to smile at me, but I just nodded and walked away. I wasn't bitter anymore, just indifferent. Her life was no longer my concern. I had built something new, something better, out of the wreckage of our marriage. And though the pain of her betrayal had left scars, I had learned to live with them. Emily, on the other hand, seemed trapped in the shadow of her mistakes. And as much as she begged, as much as she apologized, she never truly escaped the consequences of her choices. Years have passed since the divorce, but the memory of that time, though faded, still lingers in the quiet corners of my mind. I rebuilt my life piece by piece, determined not to let her betrayal define me. And I succeeded. I found peace, a kind of clarity that comes from surviving something you once thought would destroy you. For Emily, though, things took a darker turn. After I cut ties completely, she spiraled further into the chaos she had created. Mutual friends told me she had been evicted from her apartment a year after our divorce. The last stable remnant of her old life, the life she had shared with me, was gone. She moved back in with her parents, a return she had once sworn she would never make. Her mother, as supportive as she had been initially, eventually grew tired of Emily's excuses. She never stops blaming everyone but herself, her mother confided to a friend who later told me. She blames her job, the man she cheated with, even her upbringing. But she never looks in the mirror. One day, out of sheer curiosity, I searched her name online. What I found was sobering. She had tried to start a small business selling handmade jewelry, but it failed after a few months. Reviews cited poor customer service and missed deliveries, signs of a person who couldn't hold her life together long enough to follow through. I should have felt pity for her, maybe even some lingering sadness for the woman I had once loved. But I didn't. What I felt instead was relief. Relief that I had chosen to let go, to save myself from the gravity of her choices dragging me down with her. Then came the day I saw her again, years after the divorce. It was at a coffee shop downtown, a place I had started frequenting after moving to a new neighborhood. I was waiting for my order when I heard her voice behind me. It took me a moment to recognize it. It wasn't the same confident tone I remembered. It was quieter now, almost hesitant. I turned and saw her standing there, clutching a paper cup, her hands shaking slightly. She looked tired, as if life had been wearing her down one day at a time. Her clothes were neat but unremarkable, and the spark in her eyes, the one that had drawn me to her all those years ago, was gone. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I didn't want to seem cruel, but I also had no intention of inviting her back into my life. For a moment we stood there in awkward silence. She seemed to be searching for something to say, something that might bridge the vast chasm between us. "You look good," she finally managed, forcing a small, brittle smile. "Thanks," I said simply. I could see the words forming on her lips, the apology she wanted to offer, the excuses she wanted to make. But before she could speak again, I stepped in. "I hope you're doing well, Emily," Take care of yourself. It wasn't cold, but it was final. I picked up my coffee and walked away, leaving her standing there, frozen in place. That was the last time I saw her. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she eventually moved to a small town to start over. Whether she succeeded or not, I didn't care to find out. My life was no longer intertwined with hers, and I had no intention of looking back. As for me, I moved forward. I focused on my career, on finding joy in the little things, and on rediscovering myself after years of being part of a fractured partnership. Eventually, I met someone new. A kind, genuine person who understood my scars without prying into them. We took things slow, building something solid from the ground up, and for the first time in years I felt truly happy. Looking back now, I realized that Emily's betrayal, as painful as it was, taught me something invaluable. It taught me the importance of boundaries, of self-respect, and of knowing when to walk away. It showed me that no matter how deeply you love someone, you can't save them from themselves. Her choices led her to where she is now. Mine led me to peace, and that's all I ever wanted. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.